Here we go, it started.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the annual UC San Diego panel that is a partnership between Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Veg American programs and services and our counseling and psychological services at UC San Diego. So we've been doing this panel for, I think this is the 6th one. The topic changes annually based on those who are participating, and this year with an additional partner of San Diego Chi Delta Theta and their feedback around topics that were also of interest to our students. So I'm really excited that our mental health panel this year is on the mental health experiences of children of Asian American immigrants. And we have been able to get a wonderful panel to answer some questions and provide us some things to think about as May is both Asian and Pacific Islander American Heritage Month and Mental Health Awareness Month. So I'm going to pass this to the facilitators for our event today, Vanessa Nguyen and Amy Bay.
Thank you, Wendy. Oh, okay. So hi, I'm one of your facilitators. My name is Amy Bay, and I'm a third year majoring in political science, international relations, and a minor in migration and human rights. And I'm also part of SD Chi Delta Theta.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm really excited to be here. I actually attended one of the panels in my first year in person, and it was really great to hear everyone's feedback. I remember walking away from it being really inspired, so I hope the same can be true for today. And my name is Vanessa. I'm a 4th year. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm also part of San Diego Chi Delta Theta, and I am studying human development and education studies. And I'll pass it back to Amy.
Could we ask the panelists to please introduce yourselves and just share your relation regarding the topic of children of Asian American immigrants?
Hi, everyone. My name is Louis Limas. I am the liaison to the APIMEDA Community Forum on campus, and I am a licensed psychologist on staff with the UCSD Counseling and Psychological Services. Thank you for having me today on the panel, and it's definitely one that resonates with me. I come from a mother who immigrated. She was first in her family to immigrate. She was one of 4, and she was the youngest, which was kind of a big deal for her from the Philippines. And so her story was important to my development and understanding who I am and who she was and who we were as a family. And it's kind of helped shape me as a person. And so I definitely resonated with today's topic and hope to learn and talk more about it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Hufana. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the panelists and a postdoc resident at CAPS here at UCSD. I'm housed at Revelle College and one of the Triton's Flourish and outreach emphases. So my connection is a personal and professional one. I think personally for me, I am a 2nd generation Filipino American. Both my parents immigrated to the US from the Philippines my mother in the 70s when she got recruited here as a nurse, and my father in the 80s when he got recruited here as an engineer. And so I grew up in SoCal, and a lot of my professional work really intertwines with having the bicultural experience. And so I'm looking forward to chatting and speaking a little bit on that. And thanks for having me today.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Leah Taparro. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am really excited to be here with all of you. I am a licensed psychologist, and I currently work at CSU San Marcos here at their counseling center. I used to work at CAPS at UCSD, so it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. And just remembering the first year when we put on this panel, and really exciting to see the ways in which it's evolved and grown, and that it's on its sixth year already. So it's so exciting. My experience with this topic is similar to Alyssa in that it's a personal and professional one. My family are refugees from Cambodia. So I was born in Cambodia, and my family moved to California when I was either 4 or 5 years old. And so growing up, being bicultural and a 1.5 generation, there's a lot that comes with that in navigating life in the US and academically. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk with you all a little bit more and kind of share more experiences as a 1.5 generation refugee, first gen college graduate, and then being a mental health professional. So excited to be here and to learn along here with all of you as well.
I can go next. My name is Julia. My pronouns are she and her. I am currently based in the Yei area in San Francisco. I work as an academic advisor for the Educational Opportunity Program at San Francisco State. And I also went to UCSD back in the day at Thurgood Marshall College. And I also, because of EOP, I work specifically with first gen low-income college students, and that speaks so deeply to me because growing up, both my parents are refugees from Vietnam. So my mom came in 1980 and my dad in 1981, and just growing up, mental health was not something we ever talked about. And so now getting to work in education, specifically higher ed, and often being the first point person for folks to talk to about mental health has been really significant for me. I also co-founded Project Yellow Dress, which is a storytelling platform for the Southeast Asian diaspora.
Thank you for all the panelists for being here today and introducing yourselves. That should be everyone. And so we'll move on to the next question, which some of you all kind of touched on with your previous answer, but what motivated you to work in mental health growing up as a child of immigrants?
I can start us off if that's okay. So for me, when my family moved to the US, we settled. I grew up in San Diego, actually. So I grew up in City Heights. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that area. So within my community, there were a lot of immigrant and refugee families. And for me, it was just kind of observing what was happening within my community and within myself and my family, just kind of seeing that there's a lot of adjustment issues in coming to the US. There's a lot of generational differences between parents and kids and how to navigate being American, but being Asian, being Asian American, kind of this bicultural identity. And I think for me, like growing up in that area, it was witnessing my peers and the people in my community really struggling with school, how to be able to be successful in school, keep up with family, cultural expectations, and then also staying safe because there was a lot of alcohol, drug use, gang violence, poverty in my community. And for me in high school, when I had to pick a major, when it was time to apply to college, I was trying to look at all of the different majors out there. And what I looked at was, what am I really good at? Like, what is going to be something that I'm really good at, that's easy for me to do, that I also love? And I just always came back to that. People always sought out my help, advice, support, family, friends. And I looked to see what major was out there that really fell in line with this. And it was psychology. And so I went into psychology. I went to San Diego State. I took my first Psych 101 class and I completely fell in love with it, just learning more about behavior and just really thinking about going into mental health and being a provider, how can I provide support to other people that may look like me or have similar experiences? Because in the field, there wasn't a lot of people of color at that time, Asian American therapists. And so I really wanted to be able to specifically work with students to kind of talk to them about things that may impact school. Because I felt like for me, when I was in college, I wish I had known about therapy and the College Counseling Center at San Diego State, because I definitely would have gone to therapy. And so I think with outreach right nowadays within college campuses, they do a really great job of letting students know that there are therapists at the College Counseling Center to use. And so I think I just view like my whole life experiences and what I'm really good at, what I want to do, and how I can serve my community. And that was how I decided to go into mental health. And it's something so fulfilling. I really love. I've worked at a few different college counseling centers now, and I just really love the work that I do with college students.
I think that was very well said. For me, I think what stuck out to me was being able to notice, observe how mental health was discussed in my family, my relatives, and honestly, how it was not discussed, and how emotional regulation was displayed to me in different aspects of my life, again through family. And I think really what I observed is that unfortunately there was not a lot of conversational pieces about it. And talking to my mom later in life, I think part of it is because of these different aspects of the different generations have to deal with. And so it feels like talking about mental health or even emotions is just not a priority, because you're dealing with other things that are like with being an immigrant and learning the language and finding job opportunities, that these things become at the forefront. And it's important. While those things are important, I think it's also important that, man, it would have been nice to have space for not only my mother, but other family and myself to be able to process these things from a mental health, emotional perspective. And so for me, my journey has been about learning that aspect of mental health, seeing how we can make it more of a topic that's discussed among these communities and make it more normalized, and that we can hold both those things that are families or parents from immigrant backgrounds, or even ourselves from immigrant backgrounds. We can hold those things as true, but also prioritize our mental health. So that's been kind of something that I've been interested in, and has helped me reflect on through my own kind of experience growing up.
Yeah, for me, the word mental health wasn't something that I used growing up in my household. And I came from a very, maybe not my family per se, but my community. And I was in a very Catholic, Filipino Catholic community. And so what that meant was, instead of mental health, it would be going to church or going to mass, or instead of it finding solutions or resources, it would be say, it's okay, bahala na, like just pray about it, like it's going to be okay. And so I learned very young that mental health looked very differently than maybe going to therapy. So it wasn't until I went to college that I attended counseling or therapy, and that I actually felt comfortable asking for help. And so I think that's one of the things too I learned, that particularly in my own experience, but others may experience, like, mental health is not even a language I could even use. Like, it feels like coming to mental health means learning a new language in and of itself. And so that's something that motivates me from personal and professional perspectives. And it wasn't until I had mentors at UC Irvine when I was an undergrad who showed me the way that actually mental health and overall well-being is actually for everyone. I just didn't see it growing up because I saw your traditional psychology. And so once I was linked to mentors, I think I realized, okay, there is a space for all of us. It's just maybe not in the same type of words or language we would typically use.
I can go next. So for me, I think the hardest thing was when I was younger, like Asian American, the identity itself was a thing, but to specifically acknowledge my experience as Southeast Asian wasn't. And I realized at a very young age that my experience as a Southeast Asian American, and specifically coming from a refugee community, my experiences didn't quite match what I was hearing about, East Asian experiences, or what the model minority myth would always demonstrate. And in particular with intergenerational trauma, right? So I would see so many signs of PTSD growing up. So for instance, if I was separated from my grandmother for even more than a day, she would break down. One time, my brother like accidentally called 911, and the cops came and they knocked on the door, and my grandmother freaked out, and she shoved us all in the closet and just started sobbing, saying like, we're gonna get separated. They're gonna take me away. We're never gonna see each other again. And so dealing with that type of anxiety and PTSD on the very surface level, but not having the language to understand it or the space to really talk about it, right? And so growing up, I realized like much later when I was in college and grad school, that I just had so much anxiety and it had been something that had manifested since I was very young. So I rarely sleep straight through the night. Anytime I did something wrong, I would think that I didn't deserve to live. Like just really specific things that made me feel so different from everyone else. And it actually wasn't until college when I went to UCSD that I realized there were other Southeast Asian Americans who understood what I was going through, and where I also met other Chinese, Vietnamese Americans, and was like, oh my God, like we get to have this community and we get to understand each other without having to explain ourselves all the time, right? And that was also the time when I majored in history, and specifically war, revolution, and social change. And being a child of refugees, that linear progression makes sense. But I also focused on genocide studies, because in my community, death is something that is a common part of our language and our experiences. And I had so many friends who were Cambodian, who are Lao, who are Vietnamese, who are Hmong, who just also have these very traumatic experiences that history books don't talk about, right? And so I wanted to get into higher ed and either teach or work in spaces where I get to advocate for representation in whatever capacity possible. And so mental health for me is not just about encouraging my students to go seek mental health support in terms of a therapist, which I do and I openly talk to my students about. And I also am on medication for anxiety and depression, right? Like these are things I openly talk about because I know what a big difference it can be when someone who looks like you talks about these things and starts breaking down the stigma. But also it's about using art with Project Yellow Dress and recognizing that there are so many of us already talking about mental health through poetry, through creating visual mediums, through finding ways to build community in our own ways, right? It's just that it doesn't necessarily fall under what we think of in society as mental health care, but it is, right? And so getting to see more and more Asian American communities, and specifically the Southeast Asian community, talk more about mental health, using our own language to do that, it's been really, really phenomenal. And that's why working in higher ed is so important to me, because it's usually the first time that students actually get exposed to ethnic studies and get to meet other people from other communities and just start thinking about their identity in really powerful ways.
Thank you for sharing. It really amazes me how you all have like stepped up to progress to the point of like wanting to work into mental health, which kind of leads me to the next question in regards to what recommendations or strategies that you would use to communicate these mental health issues within like parents or older generations.
Sometimes I think a strategy that I think starts just a very early foot in the door technique is talking about how the person's body is responding. I think communicating pain in the body, pain in the chest. So if we're talking about anxiety, we don't call it anxiety. We just throw that label completely out the window and we just say, to whoever the loved one is lately I've been feeling a lot of tightness in my chest, tightness in my shoulders. And it's been happening a lot, like when I'm at school or when I'm talking with this person. I think that tends to help a lot with family members who are not as aware of the jargon that mental health gives out, and honestly the kind of the scariness that it gives out. And so if we're talking about sadness, depression, maybe I feel it in my stomach. And if we're trying to relate to a loved one, have you ever experienced like that? Like when things weren't going well, mom or dad or grandmother, like, did you ever feel tightness in your chest, or did you ever feel kind of uneasiness in your stomach, or do you ever feel tired? I think those are good ways to start conversation without having to use words like anxiety, sadness, depression. And honestly, in a lot of ways, those are westernized terms. And so trying to communicate the same ideas, but using the body I think can be very helpful and validating for somebody who's important to them to communicate these to family.
I went to a Buddhist high school about 2 hours north of San Francisco, really small school in the boonies. And growing up Buddhist was really complicated for me because I'm from the Bay Area, where people did talk about a lot of different concepts, right? And I was exposed to a lot of things that people in this particular community were not. And I remember when I started talking to some of my teachers about how I was feeling depressed, right? And they were like, that's not a real thing. That's like a white person thing. You just need to pray more. You need to repent more. Maybe you did something wrong. And so like, it's your karma, or you just need to take iron pills, things like that. And I remember just like internalizing that, because even though I knew I was feeling depressed, which is already something that, 13-year-old me could acknowledge, it was also hard because I was surrounded by all these people telling me that it wasn't real, right? And like aunties would send me bottles of Ensure, those cans of Ensure, because they were like, this will make everything go away. But over time, like I have been involved in the Southeast Asian community for many years now in a lot of different capacities. And again, because of all the language differences, right? And the fact that the languages I speak now are basically time capsules. I speak like a very specific 1980s style of Vietnamese, Cantonese, Hainanese, like all these different languages that, again, if you go to those countries now, they'll be like, what are you saying, right? And even nowadays, we have a hard time where trying to find the words for anxiety, for depression, for bipolar, for mental health. Most people don't know these terms, right? And there's organizations who are starting to put together dictionaries and guides and things like that. But again, it's also an education equity issue, right? And then I started really thinking about in terms of how my community is so deeply entrenched in mutual aid, right? It is not something new to our community, right? And so I remember talking to my mom about how whenever something goes wrong, whether someone went to jail, someone needs medical care, someone is failing school, they would go to my mom and ask for advice, right? And when I started talking to my mom about how she's kind of like a therapist, right? Like people seek her for guidance, right? And how mental health is not just this very esoteric thing that has like these specific guidelines, because when we think about how our community talks about grief or mental health, it is unique, right? And so I love being able to just have my mom just have a different perspective, right? But it also takes time. These conversations, it's not like you have this conversation with your mom about what depression looks like in your body, and then she's going to get it, right? It's taken years and years and years of like misunderstanding, trying to find the words and the language, like making my mom watch a lot of pop culture stuff. So I brought her to the premiere of Everything Everywhere All at Once, and she was bawling. And again, art is so powerful, y'all, to have these important conversations where direct terms do not have to translate, right? You don't have to find the exact equivalent, but the feeling you understand, right? And so for me, like when I'm talking to anyone that is from an older generation, I try to use experiences that are unique to my community so that it's not me bringing in some foreign concepts, right? Or like coming in on a high horse. It's very much, we are already trying to care for our mental health, but in ways that we just don't recognize as mental health. And then when they do, it's just so powerful. And especially during this pandemic, some of the aunties in my community for the first time started asking me like, how do I get access to Vietnamese language therapists? Right. And so it's about like gradually bringing in these concepts, and if and when they are ready, they will talk to you about it. Right? But we cannot force it. It just comes off really wrong and awkward. But it's really cool to see that more and more people are starting to talk to their parents about topics like these.
I definitely resonate with both of you so much, and thinking about how I talk to my parents and older family members about it, because when I told everyone I was majoring in psychology, they said, "What? What is that?" And then I had to explain all the years of schooling I would need to get my PhD, and that was a whole nother thing to them. And they would say, "Well, when you're done and you're a doctor, can you give me medication when I'm sick?" And it was just like having to explain to them that that's not the kind of doctor that I was going to become. So I definitely agree in terms of just starting out really small by talking to them about what they feel in their body, like those physiological somatic symptoms. And so helping to explain to my parents, like when they worry about something, are they having trouble sleeping? Are they having headaches? Are they feeling less hungry? Are they tired? Do they have body aches? And I think helping them to understand that that is part of stress or maybe anxiety, or like looking at their mood, was the only way to help them understand that that's like mental health. That's like how, it could impact our functioning. Because if I were to talk about how I'm feeling, that's not something that they're used to, because we don't really talk about our feelings in our family. It's not something that my parents grew up with. So I think it was always like talking to them about like, how are their bodies, like what are they feeling? And then something else too is that just like over these years, I think they all are starting to understand a little bit about what I do for work and what has happened now. And especially within these last 2 years of the pandemic, I think everybody knows, because I'm a therapist, I'm really good at keeping secrets, because part of my work is maintaining confidentiality. So I will have family and friends, and especially like older family members, because there's such a stigma, like a cultural stigma about talking about these kinds of things. So what I've seen in the last 2-3 years is that people will call me on the side and say, "I have a secret to tell you, and like, I need advice. What do I do?" And I will share with them like what I'm thinking and maybe like resources and support. And then it's like a secret. And I would say like, I will not say this to anyone or anything. And then, months later, I'll hear other family members telling me that this person told them this, but they will not have known that I already knew, because that person had sought me for support. And so I think there's a lot of time that's needed and patience, and kind of introducing topics and ideas a little bit at a time, that I think my family's starting to understand, like, okay, this is what I do for work, and they feel more comfortable coming to me. And I'm glad that I can do that, because I think there's such a stigma. It's so taboo to talk about family issues, that the idea of saying like, go see a therapist, like they would not do that. And I think what's really hard too is there's not going to be a lot of therapists out there that speaks Cambodian. I myself am not fluent in Cambodian, so there's a language barrier when it comes to talking about mental health with family too. And so I try my best in like some English and some Cambodian, and my parents understanding me, or having like other family members translate. But I think it's just knowing that you can start somewhere. And for students out there, it's hard to talk about it with your family, telling them like what your body feels like and explaining that. I think everyone would understand what it's like to have a headache or to have trouble sleeping. And so maybe that's where you start. And maybe that's where it might provide some understanding. But I think it does take time, and that could be the frustrating part, is that you want to talk with your parents, you want them to understand immediately, but they may not. So yeah, so those are some of the ideas that I have to share.
The only other thing I'm going to add, and I resonate with all, what everyone was saying, is that what we're suggesting are these strategies and recommendations. What I have to say is maybe we need to take 2 steps back and think, are you ready to approach your elders and parents, or vice versa? Are your parents or elders ready to hear that? Maybe or maybe not. So even, this is definitely not a one size fits all. It's actually, what we're trying to say too is that it is a big deal to approach someone and share these concerns or issues or things that you've had on your chest for a while that you've been wanting to share. And so prior to even doing this, maybe one of the reflections is, okay, am I willing to take that risk? Or what level of safety do I need to feel even before I say, hey, mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle, like this is what's been going on, and I need some support. And so I think with time, and also just having some of those reflections for yourself too, of, is this something I want to do? And if not, are there other folks that I can approach? Because I also know it's a privilege to go to our elders and families to do that. But for some of us, we may come from families and communities where it doesn't feel as safe in its broadest sense. So I wanted to highlight and recognize that too.
I also want to say that mental health care is a privilege in this country. It's something that you have to have access to. And in a lot of cases at universities, yes, it is free, but you have to pay tuition, right? You have to be ready to seek these resources. And oftentimes after you graduate, you have to pay out of pocket if your insurance doesn't cover it. It can be really hard to find a therapist that matches your background, your identity, your gender identity, whatever it may be. So again, it is a conversation that also has to really be seen through a lens of privilege and equity access.
Thank you everyone for sharing really insightful answers, and I resonated with a lot of what was said, and it sounds like it's very complex and it's something that could take time, and it's something that is up to like the individual to navigate for themselves, and hopefully with the support of other people like friends, family, like some of you all mentioned, like resources on campus while we're still students. And for our next question, we wanted to know more about the panelists' personal experiences in intergenerational trauma, tying back to the theme or the topic of today's panel. So how have you been able to navigate some of those experiences?
I can start us off with this. Just sharing a little bit earlier that my family and I were refugees from Cambodia. And so for me, I was really young and I don't have a lot of memories of what happened. And I think for me, I am fortunate that my mom and family members do share about their lived experience through the genocide, but a lot of like some of my other cousins or other people that I know, like that's something that their parents don't talk about. So for me, thinking about like the intergenerational trauma piece is my parents' experience during the genocide, like being separated from their family members, having to work in labor camps, the fear that they could be killed at any moment, like starvation, not having food, like a lot of illnesses and deaths. And even when we all were able to leave Cambodia, there's family separation. Like I have family in Australia, people still in Cambodia, family members in Canada, like there's people within our extended family that have been separated. And so I think there's a lot of trauma that comes with that. And so to be able to survive during that time, I'm pretty sure my parents and my grandparents, aunts and uncles, you know, they had to keep silent, suppress their emotions, not cause like any like issue, anything like that in order to survive. And I think the way that it has come up, that's passed on from that generation to me and maybe other generations, kind of depending on how we work through it, is, you know, my family, we don't talk about feelings, you know, growing up with my parents, like that's not a thing that we do. I was taught to be quiet, respect my elders, be obedient, don't ask questions, basically don't make any waves, like you don't want any attention. And so you think about going to college, I'm supposed to go to class and ask questions, you know, like the things that professors are teaching me, I shouldn't just absorb it. I'm supposed to ask questions, participate, talk to my professors, and do all these things that was not something I learned how to do in my family. And so it was really hard being a first gen student and kind of navigating through that and kind of having to know that I really need to like do things differently. And I think the way that I navigated was finding mentors. I don't think I would have gone through any aspect of my like educational journey or even right now in my career without mentors, like finding people out there who really understood my experiences, who were there to support me. My village of support of like family and friends, other people that understood, because there was no way I could have done it on my own. And I think what's really hard is knowing when something is part of that intergenerational trauma, because I'm almost in my 40s and I'm still learning, wow, this thing that happened last week, that's trauma, that's intergenerational trauma. And so it takes a lot of insight and awareness and processing to even know like that's trauma. And I'm still learning about that. And I think I will still have to continue to navigate and work through that on my own. And now that I'm married and I have a daughter, I have to work really hard to see and make sure it doesn't get passed on to her. But I may not know because it's something that may have happened that's embedded within my upbringing that I may not even realize. So I think it's something to always be thinking about, because even though I don't have those memories from the genocide, I was born in a refugee camp. I lived through it for the first 4 or 5 years. And so it may come up in ways that I myself don't even know. And so I think that's something important to know, is that you can try your best to work through it, but you may not know it until it comes up and someone helps you understand it. So that's some pieces of it that I want to share.
Me, intergenerational trauma is something I talk about a lot, especially like Leah, you know, having a refugee background, right? There are some things that we may never fully be able to understand because it hasn't manifested quite yet, right? But there are very concrete things that when I see it on the news or I hear about it, my body reacts pretty violently, right? So for instance, I studied genocide when I was in UCSD, and I was reading books on genocide, watching videos. Like I did not have nightmares in that way, okay? But a couple months ago when we were starting to see just so many of the imagery of Ukraine, for instance, right? And then also recognizing how many genocides they continue to be all over the world. Like what's going on in Syria has been going on for like 11 years, right? And I remember just suddenly everyone's timelines getting flooded with images of bodies, right? And how my body reacted was I finally started having those nightmares, right? I would imagine my own family running. I was like sobbing through my dreams. And then it just brought me back to how a bunch of my relatives have night terrors, right? How my mom tried to escape Vietnam 5 times before she was successful, meaning 4 previous times she had to say goodbye to each of her siblings, her mom, her dad. And for her dad, she never saw him again after she fled, right? So the way that my mom expresses love is so fierce, right? Because she's always worried that we will be separated, right? In terms of my grandmother, right? Like shoving us in the closet, right? And that fear stays within my family. And just the way that we also are stubborn, right? Asking for support is really hard being first gen, right? Like from a young age, we are expected to know all the answers to help our families navigate different spaces. I would be taken out of kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade to go translate at the hospital for my grandma. Like it makes no sense to have like a 7-year-old look at x-rays of pneumonia, right? But these are things that also shape our own understanding of what intergenerational trauma is, right? Because our family is here for very specific reasons. I suddenly have these expectations, this language for very specific reasons, right? But I also think about how when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about the harm and all the different things in our bodies, but also we need to focus on the healing, right? Because our generation, we always think about how our families had to survive. We have the opportunity to thrive, right? And there's a whole period in the middle that is all about healing, right? So I think a lot about how us being in this space today is part of that healing. I think about how when I was at UCSD, there was no Asian American Studies minor, right? But I did have ethnic studies, and my first ethnic studies professor was Dr. Thuy Dang, who was the first Vietnamese American woman who held a PhD that I had ever met, right? I also think about how we get to see more Asian American and Southeast Asian American representation on TV now in politics and all these different areas. How when I started Project Yellow Dress, there weren't as many opportunities or platforms that existed for Southeast Asian Americans, and now there's so many, right? It's very powerful to see that linear progression and also recognize that our healing is manifesting in a lot of different ways, but we also have to be intentional about it. Right. So yes, intergenerational trauma is something we may never fully understand, especially coming from a community of refugees. And we may not see the full outcome of all of this trauma for a long time, but also seeing how so many people have tried to create spaces that didn't exist when they were younger, are trying to create opportunities for those who come behind us. Like everyone on the panel today is like, just their presence in the spaces that they are in is so powerful, right? So I hope that y'all also take away that intergenerational trauma also, there is a healthier component, right? Where hopefully there's also a focus on healing as well, and the ways that we are doing that right at this second.
Okay. Thank you for sharing, Leah and Julia. And I think we're going to address multiple questions that we got through DM or like in the chat. So the first question asked was in regards to how you encounter clients whose main issue is navigating with the expectations of their parents while honoring their own American cultural values.
Yes, the answer is yes, definitely. That is a common theme that actually I think comes up for clients whose cultural backgrounds it's relevant for. And I wish it was an easy answer of how we work on it. It's just so I think the work really is involved in understanding who the person is outside of the family context now that they're in the university context, not removing family values, but just understanding like, okay, now I'm literally outside living on my own, whether it be in a dorm or off campus. And I think that's just part of that individuation process that normally takes place developmentally. And so I think a lot of the times it's articulating what are the family values that I hold dear. And so that could be faith, that could be food, it could be traditions, understanding why they're important to me. So literally articulating that. And I think the importance of articulating it is because I, as the client, was doing that as part of my regular developmental experience, like because my parents told me to, because it was something that we just did as family. But now that I'm outside of that, I'm on my own, I'm realizing how important those things were to me, and kind of understanding why they were. And I think what we find is that students have a deeper appreciation for their culture when they're able to understand how important it is to them outside of being in the family dynamic and being told to do these things, as opposed to understanding, oh, wow, these are important to me. And so I think a lot of times when it comes to honoring parents or family values, cultural values, and American cultural values, I think what we find is that they find that they don't have to be as separate and they can mesh very well. And I think sometimes they come into therapy thinking these are two wholly different ideas and I have to choose. And I think a lot of peace comes with finding that you don't have to choose and that you can find out how to hold both to be true.
Yeah, I love that question. I couldn't help but smile because with all the students I've worked with over the years, like I wish, obviously it's a confidential space, so it's not like I can tell anybody else, but it's just so many people are also longing for that same thing that you had asked. Like, do people talk about this? Is this something we navigate? And absolutely yes. I always tell folks, like, it's about living in the both and Louis, I think what you were speaking to is sometimes we feel, or some folks feel like they have to make a decision about what is it that is important to me or not. And that means relinquishing what my family had said, or removing, or, you know, becoming something I'm not, or someone I'm not. And what I have to usually say is actually, you can do both. You can do both. And it is about living in the gray per se, that is, I think, really going to change the world. I think when we live in the gray, we are the ones that get to actually do innovative, creative, healing, therapeutic things by just being who we are. And so if that does mean embracing both, if that is what, you know, you choose, then I'm all for it, right? And it is about living in the both, and you can hold multiple things.
Think a lot about how, because I work primarily with first-gen college students, right? It is such a powerful experience to see students come in and kind of start recognizing the shifts in understanding their own identity, right? But the most powerful experiences for me is when students start to recognize that they need different types of support, right? Because to honor what you have been carrying for so long, to recognize that you need something that looks a little bit different for you, right? To reimagine what it means to be Asian American, Southeast Asian American, Vietnamese American, whatever it is. I often think about the word resilience, right? And for so many first-gen students, it is kind of a part of our DNA, right? Like, you have to be resilient in order to get to this point. You know, higher ed was not designed for students who looked like us, right? And being first gen, your parents didn't have to go through the chaos of, or weren't able to go through the chaos of higher ed. And so you're kind of figuring out everything on your own. But then it comes to the point of, like, we are constantly being asked to be resilient, right? And that is a heavy burden. So when I talk to students, they often get emotional because just to have someone acknowledge what they are carrying, acknowledging the expectations that they are carrying on their backs, the fact that they would be the first in their families to get this degree, that they're also carrying their community's dreams on their back. It is so heavy. right? And so when I think about this particular question, it's yes, how do we honor our own needs, that of our family and our expectations, our culture, our communities, but also just the fact that there is no one answer here. It's about, I think, just acknowledging everyone's individual journey and trying to find that balance in the gray space, right? That gray area, right? Like you have to figure out for yourself what balance looks like. And also, again, finding people around you who are offering you that support and who see you in the ways that you deserve to be seen and support that you deserve to have, right? I always think about how students need to advocate for themselves, because oftentimes if you just sit around, that support is not going to come to you, right? So yeah, like having people who look like you or who can understand your immigrant background, your refugee background is so critical, because we often have a very specific way of seeing this student and also potentially giving them the space that they didn't know they needed.
Thank you everyone for sharing. And we'll wrap it up with one more question from the audience. Unfortunately, we couldn't have the time to go through all of the audience questions, but the question that we have for the panelists is, do you have any books or resources that you found particularly useful for mental health or intergenerational trauma among Asian Americans?
I feel like I'm pretty sure I've read some books, but I cannot just recall them. So it's going to have to be something where maybe we share with Wendy and Brian, and then maybe they can forward that along to be able to give you the correct title and authors of those books.
Yeah, there's so much movement on social media right now that all in the academic and social media spaces. I mean, what comes to mind is Asian Mental Health Collective as one. There are so many others. It might be helpful actually to put together a resource list and send to the folks that have registered for the presentation, since several kind of escape my mind right now, but yes, I absolutely have many. I just don't have them like right now to just kind of like go off. But absolutely, I think we should definitely share some community resources.
Thank you for the question. And if panelists at this time, if you have anything to share before we kind of wrap it up, please feel free to share. But if not, then I will be handing it back to Brian.
Something I want to share is that while you all are college students, utilize the resources that you have on campus. I think there's a lot of amazing, wonderful people that want to be out here to support you. And if you're feeling like you don't know where to turn to, talk to Wendy or Brian, reach out to the counselors at the counseling center, talk to someone out there. And if they don't have the answers, they will help you find the answer for that. And I think while you're in this time period, use all those resources that you have right now, because I feel like after graduating from college, it becomes even more challenging to do that. So definitely, if you can, want to try it out, willing to try out therapy. And I'm super biased because I'm a therapist, but I wish I would have gone to therapy when I was an undergrad, but I did not know about that service. And I have gone to therapy throughout different periods of my life to get support. And it's something so valuable. And I think that's part of the reason why I've learned so much about myself through the process. So if you can, try it out. Yeah.
When I was at UCSD, I did try to go to therapy, but all the therapists didn't look like me. And that was like 10-ish years ago. And now just seeing the very diverse therapists available on so many different college campuses, especially here in California, it's a huge deal. So especially if you are considering mental health services, this is the time while it's part of your tuition. I also put in the chat a resource guide. They are predominantly Southeast Asian based organizations, diaspora based organizations. But again, a lot of these orgs are very active on social media. And when I started Project Yellow Dress, like social media was the only way I was able to really build our community. And now like that's how we all connect. So I love like sliding into other orgs' DMs. We can do collaborations, all that stuff. So there are so many. If you follow one, you'll be able to follow like a gazillion other ones. And there are so many incredible organizations in San Diego, like Lao SD, right? So many amazing resources for you if you put in the right key terms in your Google searches.
Okay. With that said, thank you again, Vanessa and Amy, for moderating the panel today. It was amazing to kind of see all the panelists share their experiences and kind of hear some insights that you all have. Just as a quick, again, shout out, I think Wendy mentioned this at the start of the program today, but, and I know it's week 7 and the end of the quarter, there's all kinds of stuff going on. But if you are interested in like what Leah and Julia have mentioned and all of the other panelists as well, and potentially seeking out mental health stuff, and you want a nice like starter space to do that in, Tuesdays at 1 p.m. in both in person and virtually, we do like a hybrid setup. Louis, as he mentioned before, is our CAPS liaison. So myself, Wendy, and Louis are in our community forum space, and that's a great way to just kind of like get engaged and kind of participate in that way. That's what it is for spring. If you're watching this recording in the future time where maybe that's a little bit different, check out the website. It's probably updated, hopefully, question mark, with the updated new time that we'll have. But yeah, thank you again to all the panelists. There is, and thank you, Wendy, I'm assuming this is you sharing this. We have another future event next week. It's Major Decisions, Multiple Pathways. The kind of person leading this one, her name is Juliana or Juju Wang. She's really popular on social media. I think she's like Professor Juju on social media. But we'll be talking about negotiating Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Desi American cultural and familial expectations for academic and career goals. So that was really related to the last question or one of the last questions that I think Jim had asked to the panel. So if you're interested in seeking out more of that kind of conversation, join us next week, Thursday, May 19th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. That's an in-person event. So in the 6 College Lodge area, which is in New 6 College. So if you have questions about how to get there, let us know. I know that a new space on campus is sometimes a little bit challenging to figure out where those things are. I don't know, Wendy, if you want to add anything.
Juju is also a UCSD alumna. So this is somebody who is very familiar with student experiences, particularly here. This is also a workshop very focused for students. That is what she is planning to present. So while I know there's a lot of supportive staff and faculty, we are asking that this is a space for the students to be able to talk through and process this as well. So we're excited, and if you're able, I hope that folks are able to join in and meet Juju. She has a lot of energy, and I'm really excited to bring her to campus.
Yes, and with that said, like Wendy said, if you are a staff person in the call right now, please share this with your students. And we'll one last thank you, round of applause, virtual emojis, whatever you want to use for that, to the panelists and the organizers for the event. Big thank you to everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your days.